The soil of Virginia knew blood long before it knew Samuel's footsteps. Dawn broke with the sound of the overseer's horn, and with it, the shuffling of bare feet against frozen ground, the clank of chains that had become the rhythm of survival. Slavery was not just labor. It was humiliation woven into every breath, a darkness that swallowed entire generations. The narrator's voice cuts through that silence, painting the weight of a world where black men and women were treated as nothing, more than tools, their cries muffled by the wind carrying cotton dust and the smell of sweat. Samuel was among them, a strong man in his late 20s whose silence was heavier than iron shackles. His body bore the marks of whips, a cruel map carved into his back by men who laughed as they swung leather into flesh. Yet he did not cry. He did not beg. His strength was not measured in muscle but in restraint, in the way he carried pain without surrendering his will. Where others saw a broken man, Samuel knew what lived inside him. Rage, quiet and patient, coiled beneath the surface like a serpent waiting for its moment. From sunup to sundown he bent over cotton fields, his hands raw, his back bent under Virginia's sky. The overseer's whip snapped without reason, for cruelty was the master's language. Even when Samuel stood perfectly still, sweat dripping down his temple, the lash struck anyway, a reminder that survival was not enough. Around him, the other, enslaved, whispered prayers into the soil, calling on ancestors they could no longer name, ancestors who had been stolen across the ocean. Samuel did not whisper. His silence was its own prayer, and it was not to forgive, but to remember. In the master's eyes, Samuel was another piece of property, another nameless tool to break, to sell, to discard. But behind Samuel's gaze there was a storm. He had watched too much, endured too much. The laughter of his master's wife as she mocked the welts on his back, the jeers of Carter's sons when they spit near his feet, the nights when his belly ached with hunger, yet he still carried buckets of water to the big house. Every humiliation was a coal glowing faintly, waiting to ignite. The narrator reminds us that revenge does not come like lightning. It builds like a slow fire, sparked by injustice, fanned by grief and fed by rage until it cannot be contained. Samuel knew this in his bones. Though his lips spoke nothing, his eyes said everything. He would not be broken forever. Deep inside, something fierce burned, a promise forged in silence, a vow etched into scarred flesh. Long before Samuel ever touched flame to timber, long before the night his master's house lit the sky, the fire was already inside him. It lived there waiting, patient as the fields, heavy as the chains, certain as the rising sun. The overseers thought they owned his body, but they never saw the truth. Samuel's spirit was already sharpening itself into a weapon. The Carter plantation stretched wide and merciless under the Virginia sun, an empire of cotton fields that rolled like a white sea across the land. The air always carried the dry sting of dust, the sour scent of sweat, and the constant reminder, have who owned every inch of soil. At the edge of the field stood the overseer's watchtower, a wooden structure that loomed like an executioner's gallows, its shadow crawling over the workers as they bent their backs to pick the crop. Beyond that, lifted high on a hill, the big house gleamed with painted wood and glass windows, a monument to wealth built on broken lives. Every brick, every polished rail was bought with blood that never made the history books. Samuel worked. Beneath that cruel sky, his hands thick with calluses, his back bent in forced obedience. From dawn until the stars bled across the horizon, he toiled. The overseer's eyes never left him, and the whip was always near, coiled like a snake waiting to strike. It didn't matter if the baskets were full or the rows were perfect. John Carter believed pain was the only language worth speaking. For the smallest mistake, a stalk missed, a glance held too long, even a pause to wipe sweat from his brow, Samuel felt leather split his skin. Carter's voice would thunder behind the lash, reminding him that he was nothing, that he was property, that his breath was borrowed air. But the cruelty did not end with the field. Samuel carried wounds far deeper than the scars carved into his flesh. He remembered the night his mother was dragged from the quarters, her cries piercing the dark as Carter ordered her tied to the whipping post. Samuel had been forced to stand nearby, powerless, while the overseer's arm rose and fell until she collapsed, her body limp and broken. The memory seared itself into him like a brand, and he never forgot the way Carter smiled when he told Samuel, "Watch close, boy. This is what happens when your kind forgets their place." Those words burrowed into his bones, festering, and every time Samuel closed his eyes, he heard the echo of the whip cracking through her cries. If that had been the only cruelty, perhaps his heart might have survived untouched. But slavery stole, piece after piece, until nothing was left to call his own. Samuel's younger sister, Ruth, had been barely 15 when Carter sold her to a trader passing through. Samuel remembered her face pressed against his chest that final night, her tears soaking into his shirt as she begged him not to let them take her. He had promised her they would find each other again, a promise he knew even then was a lie. By morning she was gone, carted off in chains to an unknown fate. He never saw her again. The hole she left in him never healed. It became part of the silence he carried, part of the fire that burned unseen. Each day was a performance of survival. Samuel knew better than to speak his pain aloud. Words were dangerous. Even a look could invite the whip. So he learned the art of silence, holding his rage behind a mask of obedience. He nodded when ordered, kept his eyes low, and bowed his head when Carter passed. But inside, his memories stayed sharp, honed like blades he carried in secret. He never let himself forget his mother's broken body or Ruth's pleading eyes. Forgetting would mean surrender. Remembering was the only power left to him, and he wielded it with patience. At night, when the work was done and the overseer's horn signaled rest, Samuel lay awake in the dirt-floored cabin, staring into the dark. Around him, other slaves whispered prayers, sang quiet songs of a homeland none of them had seen, and wept for children sold and husbands whipped to death. Samuel rarely joined them. His prayers were not for mercy, but for justice, and his songs were silent oaths sworn in the quiet of his own heart. He did not cry. He let the silence carry his grief because silence was safer, and in silence no one could take away what lived in his mind. John Carter believed he had broken Samuel. He believed the chains on Samuel's wrists were chains on his spirit. But the narrator's voice knows better. Beneath every lash, beneath every theft of family and dignity, Samuel grew harder, sharper. His humanity was not gone. It was hidden, buried beneath scars and silence, waiting for the day it could rise again. What Carter could not see was that the more he struck, the more he fed the very thing he sought to destroy. Every act of cruelty planted seeds of vengeance in Samuel's heart, seeds that would one day bloom in fire. The plantation was a place of stolen families and stolen lives, a machine that ground people down into shadows of themselves. Yet Samuel carried within him a truth that could not be whipped out, could not be sold away. His memories were weapons, his silence was armor, and his suffering was the forge where revenge was being made. While others prayed to be delivered, Samuel was already shaping the moment he would deliver himself and the Carter family into the hands of justice only fire could bring. John Carter was the kind of man whose cruelty was not born from necessity, but from pleasure. He carried himself like a king in a land where he thought himself untouchable, a tyrant cloaked in fine coats and polished boots, his wealth stacked on the backs of broken men and women. His face, always red from drink, bore a permanent sneer, as though the suffering around him was a form of entertainment he could never grow tired of. Carter believed pain was the most useful tool a master possessed. He spoke of discipline, but his actions betrayed his hunger for dominance, for the satisfaction of watching another human bend and break under his hand. To him, Samuel was not a man. He was an object, a reminder of Carter's power, and a canvas upon which cruelty could be written. There were winter mornings when the frost cracked across the fields like shattered glass, when even the earth seemed too frozen to bear crops. On such mornings, Carter forced Samuel to step out barefoot, his skin pressed raw against the icy ground. He would stand over him, whip in hand, watching as Samuel's toes bled and the cold gnawed into his bones. Samuel, bent to work regardless, knowing hesitation would only earn him lashes across his back. Carter relished these displays, sneering at the sight of Samuel's breath turning white in the air, as he bent to pull cotton stalks from soil stiff with frost. He'd tell the overseer, loud enough for all the others to hear, "Let him feel the earth bite him. Maybe then he'll learn his place." But Carter's cruelty was not reserved for private satisfaction. He understood the power of spectacle. Often, when the slaves gathered in the fields, he singled Samuel out, dragging him to the center. With the others forced to watch, he stripped Samuel to the waist and let the whip sing its song across his back. Each strike cut deeper than the last, the leather curling around his ribs, tearing into scarred flesh until blood streaked down his sides. Carter raised his arm high, bringing the whip down with theatrical flourish, pausing only to sneer at the faces of the others, reminding them this was their fate too should they disobey. "You see this man?" he'd bark, spittle flying from his lips. "This is what happens when one of you forgets what you are." Samuel, biting down on the inside of his cheek, never gave him the scream he wanted. His silence only enraged Carter further, but Samuel held it as tightly as chains, refusing to give his master the satisfaction. The cruelty of the house was not confined to John Carter alone. His wife, Eleanor, shared in the theater of humiliation. She carried herself like a queen among corpses, her eyes sharp and glittering whenever pain was present. Samuel remembered the time she approached him after one of Carter's punishments, when his back was striped with fresh wounds, the blood still glistening. She circled him slowly, her fine skirts brushing against the dirt, her perfume cutting bitterly against the smell of sweat and blood. With a smile that dripped venom, she reached out a pale hand and traced one of the scars with her fingertip, as though she were admiring the grooves of a carving. Then she laughed, a sound high and cruel, like glass breaking. "Such marks," she whispered to her husband, "as if the Lord himself etched his displeasure into this flesh." Her laughter rang out across the yard, sharp as a bell, while Samuel stood motionless, every muscle trembling with rage he dared not release. It was not only Carter and his wife, but their children as well, who grew fat on cruelty and privilege. They threw rocks at Samuel when he passed, spit near his feet, mocked him as they ate their fill while he carried buckets of water with empty stomach. The entire household fed off his suffering, turning it into their nightly bread, their daily amusement. Samuel came to see them not as individuals but as one body, a single beast with many mouths gnashing at his spirit. Each smile at his pain, each careless laugh became another spark added to the fire that smoldered inside him. The narrator's voice grows heavier here, weighed down by injustice. Samuel's body was the parchment upon which the Carters wrote their dominance, each scar a sentence, each lash a word in a story not of obedience but of vengeance. Every mark across his back was not erasure, but inscription, a memory carved so deeply it could never be washed away. The overseer, Carter, Eleanor, the children, they believed they were teaching Samuel submission. What they failed to see was that they were writing his rage into permanence. Every lash written into his back, the voice intones, was a letter in the book of revenge. In the silence of the fields, in the quiet of the quarters, Samuel's resentment grew sharper. He stopped seeing Carter as a man and began to see him as a symbol, the embodiment of every lash, every stolen child, every scream that bled into the earth. And Samuel knew symbols could burn. Defiance never arrives in thunder. It begins in whispers, in quiet acts so small they might seem invisible. Samuel understood this. If he struck too soon, the whip would silence him forever. But if he learned patience, if he carved rebellion from the edges of daily life, then perhaps he could wound the master in ways unseen. And so his resistance began, not with flames, but with splinters. In the fields, when Carter's eyes were fixed on another man, Samuel loosened the handles of hoes and split them against the soil with deliberate force. The tools would crack, slowing the harvest, and though the overseer cursed and swung his whip, Samuel's face remained blank as though it were nothing more than clumsiness. He learned to disguise sabotage as accident, to turn his strength into a weapon cloaked in obedience. Every broken tool was a tiny victory, a reminder that Carter's machine was not invincible, that even the smallest fractures could spread. At night, when the day's labor ended and the overseer's torch faded from the quarters, Samuel carried his defiance further. He slipped crusts of bread and scraps of meat from the big house, hiding them in his pockets. And when darkness swallowed The cabins, he shared them with those who had gone without. He pressed food into the trembling hands of children, whose ribs showed through their skin, into the palms of mothers who had given their own rations away. The hunger never left them, but the act itself was sustenance. It told them someone saw. Them, someone still believed they were worth saving. To the Carters, Samuel was property. To his people, he became something else, silent, strong, and dangerous in his kindness. But his most dangerous defiance was not with his hands, it was with his voice. Around the low fires at night, when the children's eyes grew heavy and the elders hummed songs older than memory, Samuel leaned close and told stories. He spoke of a land far across the ocean, of warriors who stood proud against invaders, of kings and queens whose names had been nearly erased. He spoke not in sermons but in fragments, in whispers, reminding the others that they had not always been slaves, that once their ancestors had walked free with spears in their hands and the sun on their shoulders. The firelight caught the glint in his eyes as he told these tales, and though his voice was low, the truth carried like thunder through their hearts. The others listened, some weeping quietly, others clenching their fists, as if the memory of Africa was rising inside them too. The narrator draws the line clear. Samuel's silence in the fields was armor, but in the quarters he allowed the fire within him to slip through the cracks. He was no longer simply enduring, he was planting seeds. Others began to notice him differently. Where once they had seen only another bent back, now they saw a man who refused to be hollowed out. They saw the defiance in the set of his jaw, in the deliberate calm with which he carried himself after every lash. Samuel's strength became a quiet refuge, a reminder that there was something left inside them worth fighting for. The overseers did not hear it, the Carters did not see it, but among the slaves, a shift began. Samuel was not just surviving. He was resisting. He was turning grief into fuel, silence into strategy, and memory into power. And though the whip still cracked, though the chains still bit into his skin, Samuel knew he was no longer alone in his defiance. In every story whispered around the fire, in every bite of stolen bread, in every broken tool, he was building something greater than rebellion. He was building belief. And belief, once born, could not be whipped out. It smoldered, waiting for breath, waiting for the day it would blaze. There are moments in a man's life when the world tears so violently that something inside him can never be mended. For Samuel, that moment came on a night soaked in cruelty. It was not John Carter himself this time, but his son, William, a boy raised on his father's venom, drunk with the privilege of owning lives before he was even a man. William was 18, hot with arrogance, eager to prove to his father that he too could wield power. And on that night, Samuel's mother bore the weight of his brutality. The quarrel had been over nothing, a misplaced basket of laundry, a delay in serving food. To the Carters, any excuse was enough. William dragged her into the yard, the lantern light throwing her shadow long and trembling against the dirt. Samuel was held back, ordered to watch as William, fists balled, struck her again and again. His blows were clumsy but fueled by rage, the kind of rage only born from unchecked power. Samuel shouted once, a desperate sound torn from his chest. But Carter himself barked for silence, the overseer pressing the butt of a rifle into Samuel's ribs until he bit his tongue bloody. The night rang with his mother's cries, cries that grew softer with each strike, until at last her body folded into the earth. Her face turned towards Samuel, her eyes glassy, as though begging him to carry her soul where she could not. William stood over her panting, his fists dripping red, and sneered as though he had accomplished some great task. Samuel, shackled by the overseer's grip, could only watch as the last breath rattled from her chest. There was no mercy, no moment of regret from the boy who killed her, only laughter from the shadows of the big house where Carter and his wife looked on as though it were a form of evening entertainment. When it was over, Carter ordered Samuel to bury her. They handed him a shovel as though it were part of his punishment, as though forcing a man to dig his own mother's grave would crush him completely. He walked out into the field with the overseer's torch guiding the way, his body trembling, but not with grief alone. The soil was hard that night, dry and stubborn. With every thrust of the shovel, Samuel felt rage ignite deeper inside him, rage so pure it burned hotter than sorrow. His tears mixed with sweat, dripping into the earth as he carved a hollow to lay her down. When at last he lowered her into the grave, the moon hung high, pale and pitiless. Samuel knelt in the dirt, pressing his palms into the soil until his nails split. He did not weep like the boy who had once cried for his lost sister. He spoke, though his voice was barely more than a whisper, the words meant for the earth, the stars, and the mother whose body now rested beneath them. "Blood will answer blood," he vowed. "By these hands, by this fire inside me, they will know." The narrator's tone sharpens here, colder than before, heavy with the weight of an oath too dangerous to be broken. Samuel's grief did not end with his mother's death. It hardened into resolve. The man who had endured the lash in silence, who had bent under the weight of chains without breaking, was gone. In his place stood something else, something sharper, something dangerous. His silence was no longer surrender. It was the mask of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. As Samuel covered the grave with dirt, patting the soil down until the earth hid her from the night, he stopped seeing himself as a victim. The Carters had tried to hollow him out, but in doing so they had given him a purpose so clear it burned brighter than any whip's sting. He was not merely surviving anymore. He was planning. Every cruel laugh, every whip crack, every scar was a tally, a mark in a ledger that demanded to be balanced. His mother's death was the final entry, the one that tipped the scales. The overseer thought the grave would bury Samuel's will along with her. Instead, it birthed something Carter and his son could never control. Samuel rose from the dirt. That night, with the moonlight cutting across his face, his eyes no longer the eyes of a man beaten down. They were the eyes of a man who had chosen his path, a man who carried fire in his chest and vengeance in his bones. From that moment, every step he took, every breath he drew was a step closer to the night when blood would meet blood, and fire would answer cruelty with justice. The Carter house stood tall on its hill, a monument to arrogance, its whitewashed walls gleaming by day and its oil lamps glowing by night. To most, it was untouchable, a fortress of wealth where the family slept safe, while the fields below bent and bled. But to Samuel, it was no fortress at all. He had studied it for years while carrying buckets of water through its halls, while polishing its railings, while patching its roof under the overseer's eye. He knew the bones of that house, the wooden beams dry as tinder, the creaking floorboards. That betrayed every step. The oil lamps scattered through rooms that reeked of wine and smoke. He saw not safety but fragility, a nest of timber waiting for fire. Samuel's grief had become something sharper than sorrow, and his silence became the cloak beneath which he worked. He began to gather what he needed in pieces, so small, no one would notice. A rag left behind after cleaning the stables, a bit of cloth tucked into his waistband, drops of lamp oil carried in a tin he pretended to fetch for chores, kindling gathered as though it were for the cooking fire. Each piece was insignificant alone, but Samuel wove them together in secret, turning scraps into a weapon. By day, he carried burdens for his master. By night, he carried his mother's vow in the form of fire waiting to be born. The others began to notice the shift in him. His eyes no longer looked like the eyes of a man merely enduring. They were sharper, harder, carrying a glint of something that made some slaves uneasy. In the quarters, when the children had gone quiet and the elders hummed their soft, broken hymns, Samuel whispered his plan. His voice was low, steady, as though it had been rehearsed in his mind 1,000 times. Some begged him not to go through. With it, their fear rising like smoke. "They'll kill us all," one said, tears filling her eyes. Others gripped his arm with desperate strength, whispering, "Do it, for all of us." The narrator leans closer, the tone heavy and unflinching. Samuel did not ask for their permission. His mind had already crossed the line. Yet hearing their voices gave weight to his vow, turned his revenge into something larger than himself. This was not only about a son avenging his mother or a brother grieving a lost sister. This was about all of them, every scar, every child sold into the void, every soul buried nameless in Virginia soil. Fire would be their answer when words had long been stolen. As the days grew shorter, The air thickened with the charge of storms. Clouds gathered heavy above the fields, thunder rolling like drums from another world. Samuel felt it in his chest, as though the sky itself was preparing to strike with him. Each night, as rain lashed against the cabins and wind clawed at the shutters, he sat awake, staring into the dark, imagining flames devouring the Carter house beam by beam. The storm outside became a mirror of the storm inside, nature itself conspiring to bear witness to his vengeance. Every step was deliberate. Every glance at the house was a measurement. The creak of the boards beneath his feet, the smell of oil. When Carter's wife lit her lamp, the way the curtains swayed in a draught, all of it was catalogued, stored in the ledger of his mind. Carter thought Samuel broken, thought his silence proof of defeat. But what Carter could not see was that Samuel's silence was the silence of kindling, waiting for the spark. And so the plan was sealed. It would not be carried out in rages, blind rush, but with patience, with the precision of a man who had studied his enemy so well he could burn their world down with the same tools they had handed him. A storm gathered in the sky. A storm gathered in Samuel's chest. Soon the two would meet, and the fire that lived inside him would no longer be hidden. It would consume the house on the hill and everything within it. Midnight settled heavy over the Carter plantation, a silence so complete it pressed against the skin. The air was thick with the smell of rain still clinging to the earth from the earlier storm, and the moon broke through the clouds in shards of silver, laying a pale light across the fields. In the big house on the hill, the Carters slept in the comfort of their arrogance, their doors unbarred, their lamps snuffed, believing themselves safe within walls built from the labor of broken backs. But down in the shadows, Samuel moved with the certainty of a man whose time had come. He carried nothing more than cloth, oil, and the fire he had guarded inside himself for years. His steps were slow and measured as he approached the house, the wood groaning under his weight as he slid into the crawl space beneath. Here, where rats skittered and the air stank of damp soil, Samuel pressed the cloth into corners, doused it with oil, and touched flame to it. The match flared, small and fragile, but Samuel's eyes reflected the blaze as though it were the rising of a new sun. Flames licked the walls like hungry tongues, tasting the timber, devouring it with glee. He stayed long enough to see the fire take hold, to watch the sparks climb greedily upward. When he slipped back into the field, the silence of the night had already changed. A low crackle whispered against the wind, subtle at first, then growing louder as orange light pushed through the cracks of shuttered windows. Samuel stood in the tall grass, his chest rising slow and steady, the glow of fire painting his face in shifting shades of gold and red. He did not flinch when the first scream shattered the night. A child's cry, high and desperate, cut through the crackle of burning wood. Behind it, the deeper shouts of Carter himself, commanding, panicked, then choked by smoke. Samuel's expression did not change. The flames climbed higher, wrapping themselves around beams and curtains, spilling out through shattered glass. The roof groaned, timbers straining under heat that warped nails and split wood. Inside, shadows darted frantically, figures pressed against glowing windows before vanishing into smoke. The cries turned into coughing, then into wails, then into silence broken only by the roar of fire. Samuel's eyes narrowed as he saw Carter stumble into view behind a window, clawing at the glass, his face twisted not in power, but in terror. For years Samuel had seen that face laughing over his pain, smiling as his family was torn from him. Now it was a mask of fear, illuminated by the fire Samuel had given him. The narrator's voice does not exult in this. There is no triumph, no gloating, only the gravity of justice long delayed. This was not joy. This was balance, the earth reclaiming what had been stolen, the fire answering generations of suffering with its merciless light. Samuel stood still, unmoving, as though rooted to the soil itself, while the house began to buckle. The roof sagged, then collapsed inward with a thunderous crash, sparks spiraling into the night sky like a storm of fireflies. The screams of Carter and his family were swallowed by smoke, devoured by the same flames that had once cooked meals for their feasts, lit their games, and warmed their laughter. The house that had stood as a monument to cruelty was now nothing but a pyre. In the distance other slaves had woken, Some stood outside their cabins, hands pressed over their mouths, eyes wide in shock and awe. They did not speak. They dared not. But Samuel felt their eyes on him, and he knew some would understand what he had done, even if others trembled at the thought of what punishment might follow. The fire roared louder, rising higher than the watchtower, higher than the trees, a beacon that could be seen for miles. It was no longer just Samuel's vengeance. It was a message written in flame against the night sky. He whispered then, his voice low enough that only the fire heard it. Ruth, his sister's name, carried away by the wind, joined the smoke that spiraled upward. For her stolen innocence, for his mother buried in the cold ground, for every scar across his back, he had answered. The fire crackled as though it understood, as though it bore witness to his vow fulfilled. The house collapsed. Further, the final timbers breaking under their own weight, sparks exploding outward in a rush of heat. Samuel's face remained calm, solemn, the flickering light etching his features into something timeless, something unyielding. He did not smile, did not cry. His silence was as complete as it had always been, but it carried a new shape now. It was no longer the silence of submission, but the silence of a man who had become the storm. When at last the flames began to consume themselves, sinking into blackened rubble, Samuel turned from the sight. Behind him the house was gone, reduced to cinders and ash, the carter's cries forever buried in smoke. The night was no longer silent. It pulsed with the memory of what had burned. Samuel walked into the darkness, the fire still burning behind him, but the greater fire alive within him, a fire that no water, no whip, no chain could ever put out. Dawn came slow, the sky bleeding pink and grey over the fields, as smoke still curled from the ruins on the hill. The Carter house was no longer a house, but a blackened skeleton, its proud walls collapsed inward, its roof nothing but charred timbers jutting like broken teeth. The smell of ash and wet earth hung heavy, a silence thicker than any the plantation had ever known. One by one the slaves emerged from their cabins, drawn by the sight, their faces pale in the morning light. They stood together in the dirt, eyes wide, staring at what no one had believed possible. The master's fortress reduced to cinders. Some trembled, fear gnawing at their bellies. They knew the world of the whip, and they knew retribution would fall hard when the neighboring planters heard what had happened. They whispered of dogs being sent, of soldiers arriving, of hangings carried out in the open fields. The thought of what might come hollowed their stomachs, and for many the fire on the hill was less a victory than a curse. Yet among them others stood differently. They did not tremble. Their lips pressed tight, and in their eyes flickered something that had been buried for too long, a quiet, dangerous pride. They had seen Samuel walk among them with silence sharper than steel. They had seen him endure lash after lash without breaking. Now, in the smoke rising from the ashes, they understood. He had struck where no one dared. He had taken the master's power, the very walls that had loomed over their lives, and turned them to dust. For the first time, they felt the unthinkable. Proof that chains were not the only truth of their existence, that even in bondage there was a spark no whip could extinguish. By the time the overseer and the few remaining hands stumbled toward the ruins in disbelief, Samuel was already gone. He had vanished into the woods before the first light broke, slipping away as silently as he had endured his suffering. No one knew where he went, north perhaps chasing whispers of freedom, or deeper into the wilds where no master could claim him. His absence was as sharp as his presence had once been. In the cabins, they spoke his name in hushed tones, not as a man but as something larger, something carved into their memory with fire. The narrator's voice grows heavy, solemn. Samuel became a figure both feared and admired, his act echoing beyond the smoldering ruins. To the whites he was a fugitive, a monster to be hunted, a warning to others of the dangers of giving slaves too much freedom. But to the enslaved who had lived in his shadow, he was a proof of life, proof that they were not powerless, that a man in chains could still choose to rise and strike. His vengeance had not erased their pain, but it had carved open a space where courage could breathe. For years to come, the story lingered like smoke in the fields. Children whispered of the night the Carter house burned. Old men retold it as if it were scripture. And in every telling, Samuel was not just one man but a symbol. The fire in his chest carried into theirs. Though the masters rebuilt their walls, they could never rebuild the certainty that had once existed. The slaves had seen what one man could do, and that memory burned brighter than any torch. The night Samuel vanished into the woods became the night they learned that even beneath the weight of chains, they still carried the power to set the world alight. Long after the ashes of the Carter house cooled, Samuel's name lived on in whispers. Around fire pits in the quarters, when the day's labor ended and the overseer's shadow finally retreated, men and women leaned close to tell the story of the man who had done what none thought possible. They spoke of the night flames devoured the big house, of the screams that once rang with power now drowned in smoke, of a man who walked away into the woods and was never seen again. He became more than flesh and blood. He became a legend. Living ghost carried in the mouths of the enslaved. The narrator widens the lens, placing Samuel's fire alongside other great rebellions. His story became one of many threads woven into the fabric of resistance, echoing the cries of the Haitian Revolution, where the enslaved cast off their chains and carved a nation out of defiance. His fire flickered in the same breath as Nat, Turner's rebellion, a reminder that even when the world tried to crush them, there were always those who rose with vengeance burning in their veins. Samuel did not have an army. He had no soldiers to rally behind him. But in the silence of his rage he had carried out his own war, a war that spoke to the powerless with more weight than armies ever could. To the masters, Samuel became a warning. A nightmare told to frighten their children into obedience. They called him a demon, a madman, a beast who turned on the hand that fed him. Yet in the quarters, his name was carried like a prayer. Mothers told their children that Samuel had struck back for every mother whipped, for every sister sold, for every father buried in the fields. Men repeated his vow, that blood would answer blood, as they clenched their fists in secret. The man who burned the master's house became a phrase heavy with meaning, more powerful than chains. No one knew if Samuel reached freedom or if he fell in the woods to dogs and rifles. His body was never found, and that mystery only deepened the legend. For some he lived on, roaming free beneath northern skies. For others he had become one with the fire itself, a spirit of vengeance walking the night. Wherever he was, his story remained. A flame passed down from fire pit to fire pit, proof that even in the darkest soil of bondage, fire could bloom. That was Samuel's story, the man who carried silence like a weapon and fire like a vow. His hands bore scars, his back bore lashes, but his spirit carried something no chain could hold. He was not a general, nor a leader of armies, yet in one night of fire he left a mark greater than the walls he burned. The Carters are long gone, their house remembered only as ash, but Samuel's defiance still breathes in the memory of those who whisper his name. He proved that even the most broken can strike, that even in bondage there is power waiting, silent, patient, and unyielding. If this story reached you, share your reflection so the world remembers the fire that chains could not silence. These stories were meant to be buried, meant to be forgotten in fields watered with sweat and blood. But memory is resistance. Every time Samuel's name is spoken, every time his story is told, the fire rises again. Leave your thoughts below. Tell what this story means to you and why it matters that voices like Samuel's are not lost to time. The past breathes through remembrance, and only by carrying these stories forward can we honor those who refuse to bow. If you want more stories like this, let your voice be heard, because silence buries, but memory keeps the fire alive.